Hello, good evening, welcome. My name's Chris. I'm a bookseller here at Boswell. If you didn't know that, now you know that. First things first, our first order of business is always is to tell you that today is day 5,342 that Boswell's been here and been in business. I'm really, really and truly thrilled to welcome Salvatore Pane, wonderful author, my dear friend. He is author of Last Call in the City of Bridges, The Theory of Almost Everything, two fantastic novels. He's also author of the nonfiction book, kind of undescribable nonfiction book, Mega Man
good?
3,
Is that good or bad?
in a good way, in a good, like
Okay.
cross genre, if you will.
Yeah.
He co-wrote a textbook too, just for funsies, I guess. It's called Story Mode, The Creative Writer's Guide to Narrative Video Game Design. And he's written video games too, including Retromania Wrestling, and we'll talk about wrestling. Published in lots and lots of journals like American Short Fiction, Prairie Schooner, Story Magazine. He has a list of credentials that makes everyone jealous. And he's currently associate professor at the University of St. Thomas. And also holds an MFA from the University of Pittsburgh, just like me. He's here today with his Autumn House Fiction Prize winning short story collection, The Neorealist in Winter. It matches his shoes. You can read great reviews of this out there, any old publication you'd like. So let me tell you what I thought of it. I said Sal Payne gleefully bounds back and forth across two continents over the course of a century to portray a breadth of Italian-American experience in stories that are funny, triumphant, and beautifully sad. It's a showcase for his ability to bend form to his will in service of complex, mature emotions. It's also a book about that so classically American theme, failure. The failure to connect, the failure to clearly know ourselves and our world, and the failure to hold on to family and the past and the guilt that attends it. This is a fabulous story collection. It taps deeply into the joy and the pain, triumph and tragedy of anyone who's really alive. Please give my friend a welcome.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm just so thrilled to be here, and I'm so happy to be here with you, Chris. So
It's very kind of you.
I'm just so happy. So I've known Chris since we were graduate students in the creative writing program at the University of Pittsburgh. What, you showed up in 2008?
Give or take, yeah.
Okay, so it's
Sounds about right.
Yeah, so it's been a while. So yeah, I'm very thrilled to be here. I'll just give you a short kind of spiel about the book. So it's The Neorealist in Winter. It's a short story collection. There's 11 stories. They mostly focus on people just being obsessed with different types of media and a lot of Italian American stuff, and Italian Americans kind of being obsessed with their own reflections in media. So things like The Sopranos and Godfather and things like this, and then acting out the things that they've kind of seen in media. So that's just a brief little bit about the book.
Accurate, I think.
Thank you. Okay.
So yeah, if you want to read a page or so.
Yeah, I'll just read a very, very brief section from a story called Mama Draga. And I thought I would read this one because it's set in Pittsburgh, which is a city that reminds me a lot of Milwaukee. I'm not from here. I live in St. Paul, but I really love this city. I've only been here 2 times, but every time I come, I'm like, oh, this is just like Pittsburgh, which is one of my favorite places on earth. So Mama Draga. Frank bought the skateboard 7 weeks after his divorce. It gave him something positive to focus on even before it arrived, when it was only a tracking number, a link to refresh late at night, when Frank blinked himself awake and remembered he was no longer in his split level, but instead his childhood bedroom in Squirrel Hill. He reached for his cell phone on those sleepless nights and flooded the tiny room with artificial light. There it appeared, the Crimson Cross 8 by 31.5 inches pre-assembled skateboard, moving in an unbroken line across America, headed straight for Frank Catalano, fresh divorcee. He sliced through the packing tape when it finally arrived, raising the board high above his head like something holy. As a teen at the turn of the millennium, Frank had goofed around with skateboards like the rest of his athletic friends, would clip a Discman to his jeans and sail across those inky black parking lots. Even then, he couldn't compare to the best skaters of Central Catholic, kids who effortlessly grinded rails and impressed the girls who smelled permanently of patchouli. Frank was captain of the hockey team and occasionally landed a successful kickflip, while his best friend Rocco hooted from the trunk of his car. So it wasn't nostalgia that summoned Frank back to skateboarding, but something more difficult to convey. He deleted most of his social media accounts after the divorce. He knew what he'd find there and couldn't bear. scrolling past Amy, mugging in her new house, or posing with her brand new hybrid. But Frank held on to Instagram because he never uploaded pictures and hadn't added a single friend. Instead, he went by the anonymous black and gold 1984 guy and confined himself to the Discover tab and its surprising amount of hockey reels. Each time he liked a video of some rando landing a trick shot, the algorithm would remember and beam related topics his way. This led him to skateboarding and the many reels of daredevils attempting goofy foot nollies over car-sized gaps. He had no illusions about leaping gaps himself. Pickup games at the ice complex kept him in shape, but he was still a 36-year-old man who drank a case of Yingling every week. But if he could just skateboard again and balance the weight of his body on that wooden board for even a handful of minutes, then he could definitively prove to himself that he was headed in the right direction and not a fool for nurturing hope for the future. Frank tucked the new skateboard under his arm and climbed into the sedan, a Saturn with 250,000 miles on the odometer. The art under the board depicted a bloody cross guarded by ghosts, nothing macabre, just some ragtag Caspers like kids on Halloween wearing bed sheets with their eyes cut out. He'd chosen this board on impulse, grateful for that familiar rush of endorphins, the chemical happiness produced whenever he, quote, did a capitalism, quote, like his Gen Z coworkers teased him. Frank zipper merged onto the highway and drove to the suburbs, steering into a boarded up strip mall. Thanks to a dozen how-to videos on YouTube, Frank knew exactly how to position himself on the board above the smooth pavement, how to lead with his right foot and push off with his left, how to swivel his sneakers in the proper direction. All of this was muscle memory, and Frank felt deeply reassured by how easily it returned, how quickly he picked up speed and carved circles just by crouching and leaning slightly to the left. Skating made him feel like a tiny bird had hatched inside his body, a delicate secret that flushed his cheeks. He couldn't kickflip or ollie or grind, but he could at least propel himself forward. That, more than anything else, was something worth living for. Frank sprained his ankle 2 weeks later. And then I'll stop there, but it basically goes on and he never skateboards again because he is horribly injured basically after that point.
Yeah, nice job.
Thank
you. Yeah. I love in this story, I'm going to go off script already here. I love in this story how often he's checking a screen and how much screens are involved. What made you want to write about that? I mean, you do this really nice job of kind of understanding how this computer is like, it's his future, the skateboard's coming, but it's also his past. It's these windows back and forth into everything.
Yeah, so my first book, Last Call in the City of Bridges, it was all about cell phones and just about social media. And I think when we were students was the first time where I really started to notice just, you'd go out and you'd see people put phones on the bar and just on their tables. And this always depresses me and just horrifies me. And so I was very horrified of it, 11 years ago. And I'm like, I want to write about a book about this, about 25-year-olds and cell phones and how awful it is. And now it's 11 years later, and I feel like things are way worse. And you just see everyone using their cell phones, and myself included. I haven't learned the lessons of my writing or the book, and I'm still just like, yeah, I better check the score of something or check my email just constantly. Totally. So it's that type of, like this story is the one story in the book that veers into horror a little bit. Mm-hmm. And when I think of like what is one of the most horrifying things of our time, it is the way that we are attracted to these screens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're living another life concurrently with this one that you're trying to live. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. You point that out in your description too, that the book's about that. But for all of that, I mean, this book is so, I think, about really universal themes. It's about people leaving home, grappling with leaving home behind. It's about leaving behind an old life for a new one, what's lost, what's gained. It's about trauma. Yeah, and you're dealing with this across centuries too. Am I leaving anything out?
No, I think that's beautiful. Yeah,
great.
That's great.
Go to Vent, everybody. No. Well, one of the huge things you're dealing with in the book, or talking about, is Italian Americans. All of your characters are Italian or Italian American. You are Italian American, correct?
So they tell me.
Fair enough. I'm curious. after reading this book, growing up, was that identity, like, were Italian important to you and your family in your childhood, or was it just kind of there, or somewhere in the middle, or?
Sure. So I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is, you know, we know, most people know it from The Office or Joe Biden. Like those are our two exports to the world. Although The Office is really coming from LA, but it's a huge Italian American enclave. So there's just a massive history of coal miner, or really sulfur miners coming from Sicily to work in the coal mines of Scranton. And the coal mines were basically all closed by the time my parents' generation even entered the workforce. So Scranton's been on a kind of depressed city, you know, probably for the last 70 years. It's definitely on an upswing, but there's a huge Italian American community. So in my family, it's very, very Italian American. You know, most everybody is Italian American. So it's very much the Sunday sauce, all that type of stuff. Everybody's very loud, you know, and all this stuff. And when I was a kid, I just assumed that this was normal, or just this was everywhere. You know, this is how everyone behaves. And then it was when I really left Scranton, like, oh, okay, this is unique in a way.
Yeah.
And that made me appreciate it in a different light.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the way a lot of people come to find their heritage, is like, it's just there. That's what's normal. And then it's not until later they identify that as like, oh, heritage. I have that too. That's not just something from a book. Yeah. I think, how did you come to write about it though? Because your first couple books were not, to my knowledge, like explicitly about that kind of Italian American identity. So what was, when were you like, I need to write about this? I want to write about this.
I really pushed back against it for
Yeah.
probably my entire 20s and a lot of my 30s too, where I didn't want to really think about it or write about it. And I wouldn't watch Martin Scorsese or the you know, I'd seen The Godfather and I'm like, I don't want to really think about this. And now that's all really changed. It's probably two things. Is one, I took a group of students to Italy maybe 4 years ago, and in the run up to that, I lived with them for 90 days. And that experience really changed the way that I kind of thought about it. But also, you know, a lot of the book is about separating from family. I feel really isolated from my family, you know, so not my whole family. Like I talk to my parents and things like that pretty regularly, but I no longer have that connection that I once had as a child, which is true, I think, of a lot of people who move away.
Sure.
So then I started to fill it. I filled the void with this thing, right? Which is just me kind of like mainlining all this stuff of just watching every Scorsese movie, learning Italian. You know, now I'm going to watch all these Fellini movies. I started teaching an Italian film class. So as I have less of a relationship with these human people, I replace it with media. And that doesn't seem great. And that seems to be what I wanted to write about in the book. And I'm using that as kind of the lens.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's the perfect tension again between the screen, this other life, this falling into it at the same time. Like, you have real needs, you have real desire for connection. Absolutely. I'm really curious about that too, Italy, because some of the stories are set in Italy over the years. How did your travel there kind of open up the world for you and open up the world for your writing?
I think it's really hard for me to write about a place I haven't been and haven't like really explored. So I would have never felt brave enough to do it before. Charles Baxter, he says, you know, my imagination lives in the Midwest. And I think like that's such a great phrase. So even though he lives in St. Paul, you know, he's always really writing about Wisconsin or just, you know, different, Ohio or things like that, you know, and that really makes sense to me. You know, the other thing is like I read a lot of Italian writers. So probably the entryway for a lot of people is Elena Ferrante. And I love her. I just think she's a tremendous writer. And then that led to like Natalia Ginsburg and Elsa Morante and all these other writers from right after World War II. And you kind of see what they're doing in terms of like, these are narratives about families. These are narratives about should I stay or should I go? And these are narratives about like the dissolution of family. And that like hit me in a big way.
Yeah. Wow. Something to, and you told me this the last time I saw you, we were talking about your work and your writing about Italians and Italian Americans, and it stuck with both Aaron and I think it's hilarious, is that you pointed out like in a lot of, there's a very specific Italian American culture that's depicted in a lot of media, some of the films you're talking about and everything. And there's no really nice way to put this, but you, again, I'm paraphrasing you here, is that in the homeland in Italy, they were not sending the best and brightest over. They were not sending perhaps the greatest representation or what they thought of as the greatest representation of high Italian culture at the time. But it's so embedded in the American fabric of life, our conception of it. How do you explore that tension in your writing or think about it?
Well, so growing up in an Italian American enclave, there's this obsession with the homeland, like, oh, the homeland and our ancestors and all this stuff. And then you get over there and they're like, oh, yeah, you come from all the idiots who were poor and starving. And they had to leave because they were so poor. That's why they're over there. And we're here in the good graces of Europe.
Yeah.
So it's very much the Mad Men meme of like, we don't even think about you, and like that was just hilarious to me of like, oh, they think we're clowns, so this whole thing that has been lionized in The Godfather and Mean Streets and Goodfellas, like things that I love so much are kind of seen as more comical, so in Italy I kept finding people had weird responses to it, where people would come up to me when my wife and I were in Sicily this summer, and people are like, oh yes, you have the blood of a Sicilian, you're one of us. And I also find that really off-putting too, in a way, because so Sicily is filled with like a lot of African migrants, and they can't there's no legal path for them to become citizens, but I could become a citizen, and their children can't, so their children are raised there, no Italian, are fully embroiled in the culture, but somehow I'm considered more Italian, and that is very gross to me.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
But I want that acceptance too, so it's I think that's the tension in the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you catch it. I mean, I think, speaking of using the screen for another reference point here, I think of The Sopranos when they go over to Italy, and how there's some very funny scenes of them, like, I don't know how to navigate this for sure.
Yeah, where Pauly Walnuts goes "Buongiorno," right? That's the meme when he goes to Italy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Bingo. Yeah. Speaking of the screen a little more, the Goodfellas story. There's a fantastic, one of my favorite stories in the book. I will poorly paraphrase, poorly summarize. A young professor dealing with personal tragedy, who becomes obsessed with the movie Goodfellas. Speaking of Scorsese, kind of to cope, to distract himself. And to me, the story is about how people find an obsession to fill a hole, right? It's about, we find something to fill the hole, the grief, the depression. And at the same time, consciously or not, it's so we've got something else to focus on, so we don't have to deal with these feelings we can't actually deal with. Is that, I'm getting that? Is that what you're trying to capture in that story?
What if I said no? Just not at all. That's, how dare you? No, that's exactly it.
Just storm out.
Yeah, just smash the stuff. No, a student just asked me about this story. And he was at a reading like this, and he asked me like, what's the line with using pop culture, like when to use it, when not to use it in your writing. And it's something I think about a lot, because it could be a crutch. And I often think it's a crutch in bad writing to just rely on pop culture. So I try not to do it too much in the book, where a lot of the pop culture in the book is imagined. It's pop culture I designed, like the first story, it's about a director and his fake filmography. But in this story, my general, what I told the student was, if it's characterization, it's fine. So if you're using pop culture as characterization, it makes total sense to me. So in this, his obsession with Goodfellas is just a stand-in for his depression, and like the story very directly leads with it. So yeah, you're totally right. Like that's the idea, is like, I think when you're depressed, at least for me, you just fall into habits and routines that you feel safe in. And then I think it says a lot when it's the guy just watching, the mobsters get mowed down over and over and over again, and the one who escapes. Yeah. Spoilers for Goodfellas from 1990.
It's been close to 40 years. I think it's all right. I guess, how many times have you seen Goodfellas is the question then. Do you want to admit that publicly?
Well, that's my wife. How many times have I? How many times do you think I've seen it? That's diplomatic. I would say probably 100 times.
Okay.
100 times, not that bad. Yeah. A reasonable amount of times. But it's a great movie.
It is. Yeah. It's not Shrek 2 or something. It's not Weekend at Bernie's 2.
That's also a great movie.
I did. There's a good reference to it in the book. But anyway, it's a very cinematic book. I love that about, I mean, not just referencing film, but in scene. I think even what you read, you're following very visually everyone. I think you're moving really well that way. And you said, you're teaching film now, you've gone deeper and deeper into that. Is that a conscious choice? And how's film kind of influenced your writing and influenced your approach to this book?
It has influenced it quite a bit, I would think, because when I was in college, I had a creative writing professor, and he was amazing. He was just the best. But he told me, like, don't watch movies because movies are inferior, and they will. Teresa's rolling her eyes, my wife, because she had them too. But movies will poison your mind, and you won't be able to write because movies are a lesser art form. So from that point on, I'm like, I'm not going to watch any more movies. I'll just watch bad movies, for pure entertainment. I kind of went the other way once, 15 years later, 20 years after that, and felt like maybe that worked for him, or maybe that's just, I think about this all the time as a professor, like, oh God, they're going to remember some offhand thing I say and think it's what I believe 20 years from now. So it could just be something he said that day. But yeah, as I became more obsessed with film, I started to think about what my fiction lacked was a visual movement sense. So when I think about my first novel, it's very dialogue, ping-ponging across the page. It's people sitting in bars and having conversations. And then they go to a dinner party and have another conversation. And then they go here and have a conversation. So I was really trying to see, like, how visual can I be and how can I lessen my reliance on dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you succeeded. And as someone who likes your first book, for what it's worth, but yeah, you've added an element, I think, in this book that really brings something special and extra out. One more film thing. Your cat is Martin Scorsese, the cat, right?
Yes.
Let's talk for a minute. We were texting about pets, and this is a very odd question, I'm realizing now, but what the heck? Because for me, I think we were texting about, like, I can't imagine not having animals in my life now. And I think it's made me a better writer in some ways, considering, there's an empathy with a different creature and trying to see the world not just through another person's eyes, but from a very different perspective. So has Martin Scorsese, the cat, changed your approach to writing or art or your life as an artist?
That's an incredible question. I think, probably most of you have had pets or have pet. I think it makes you more empathetic and makes you just more, you're just a sweeter person around the animal. You're more vulnerable around the animal. I think like those traits are inherently essential. They're essential traits for being an artist, right? Like you have to have empathy for other people. Like that is, to me, is like the most important thing about being an artist, and like the sign of a good artist, right? It's like that is the first thing that you have to build off of. So 100%. I mean, the other thing is now I'm like, okay, I have to make sure that my writing doesn't disturb the cat, because if he's hungry, it's like I have to just drop what I'm doing and feed the cat immediately,
Yeah, absolutely.
So I write around his schedule. And he's hungry all the time. I mean, it's just constant.
It's a tough life you lead. It's a tough life, Sal.
Tough life he leads. I mean, he just lays around and eats food. I mean, come on.
I used to listen to the click clack all the time, so it's mildly irritating, I suppose. No. All right. Let's talk about the historical context. I think this is something I think you've always done in your writing and stories. I think you've always been really interested in placing scene and placing what's happening in a very specific moment in time, and very much in the real world. Your first novel, the opening scene, is the night of Obama's first election in 2008, and it's very tied to place. These stories are all over the place in time, though. We're in Scranton in the 70s, we're in Rome during the Nazi occupation, and further from that, we're on the set of a forgotten TV sitcom in the 90s. We're all over the place in this book, and I love that because they're all still so very grounded in real places, or your imagined version of real places. Did the places, is that coming from character for you, or do you have these settings in mind and you're finding stories for them, or how does it work for you? Why is that so important to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, setting 100% is character. Settings always, I always think it's the melting pot, or not the melting pot, but the crucible in which people are formed is where they're from, right? So it's like everything about who I am as a person goes back to being born in Scranton. And it's just like very working class, very specific type of culture, and everything in my life has been in response to that, whether positive or negative, so I always start there with the characters. Like I can't imagine writing anything where I don't know where any of where even a single character is not from. I think the diversity of location and setting in this book is because of how long it took me to write it. So this is about 8 years worth of stories. So it's a pretty long, amount of time. So the earliest story is Zeitgeist Comics, which is about, it's basically a Stan Lee type of character, and how he's kind of taking advantage of people in the 40s, or right in the 40s, which is something that happened. So I really wanted to write about that. But then, so when I was putting the book together and putting the collection together, I didn't want it to be the Sal Payne greatest hits book. So I had enough material for a while, but I wanted to wait until I felt like they were thematically cohesive. So this finally felt like the time where I'm like, okay, the settings play off of each other, the themes are playing off of each other. Now is the time to kind of pull it together.
Yeah, for sure. I'll pay you one more compliment, then it's all downhill from here. But I do, this story collection does what my favorite story collections do, which is it isn't just a greatest hits. It's not just a collected. This is your way of opening up a world to the reader. You're saying, come in, come follow this specific group of people throughout time with a reader. I really love that about this book.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about Scranton though. The book goes to a lot of romantic places, but less romantic places. Scranton, Pennsylvania. I think it's really interesting that you're from there, but the one story that really sticks out to me in Scranton is set in the 70s. What made you want to, it's very stylized. It's almost written noir-esque, film noir-esque. This guy's hiding out in a cheap motel and there's money owed. You're from Scranton, so what made you want to write about that place, but in the past?
Wow. I feel like I'm always writing about Scranton. I feel like I've never written anything that wasn't about Scranton, even if it's not set there, even if I'm going into the future or something. When I try and experiment, like I'm just always writing about it. So it just seems I'm just, so to the Charles Baxter quote, like that's where my imagination is.
Sure.
It lives in this space of just a kind of Rust Belt town. And I think for me, I've always felt like I'm living in the epilogue of something. So like the town's heyday is long past, but also I think what it means to be an Italian American, like what does that even mean, right
Sure.
now? Like what could it possibly mean? It's over, so it's like it's something I didn't even really experience. It's something that my parents could talk about experiencing, but even I didn't really see, so I could see it through movies and be like, oh, okay, I guess that's what it was like. And like I can see angles of it. So I think there's like an apocalyptic kind of sensibility you get coming from a place like that. So even if the stories are set in the past, it's kind of me wanting to explore that, and not being, but even that story is about like, oh, it's all ending, everything's
Right.
ending.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. That's really interesting. Perhaps a way for you to find a window into a past that you couldn't be a part of. Or fine. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, other than that, there are so many gorgeous, wonderful settings in this book, and you go to so many fascinating places. Do you have a favorite setting in the book, or something that you're just like, I have to write about this?
Probably the most, wow, that's such an interesting question. I think the most fun I had was, I like to, I think in a short story, you can really experiment in kind of a really big way. And I can do things I don't think I'd be brave enough to do in a novel. And there's one story, and it's about a pro wrestling promoter, like, so someone who runs a professional wrestling kind of, like federation. And it's the story is told in the form of his autobiography, but we're getting one isolated chapter midway through the book, and the biographer has had it with this person. So he's constantly adding footnotes, complaining about the text and making it clear that what we're reading is not really what occurred. And I really loved that format. I thought it was really fun to layer the multiple voices. And briefly, I did think, I'm like, could this be a novel? But I don't think I'm brave enough to try and do that experiment over 250 pages. Seems hard, or just like maybe not sustainable.
Yeah, I love the way you set that story up, because within the first page or so, we're in the voice of the wrestling promoter who very clearly goes on a rant about all the ways he's been wronged, all the people who've wronged. It's chapter 6, right? 1982, chapter 6 in this wrestling promoter's life, and all the ways he's been wronged. And then there's a footnote that immediately is the ghostwriter saying, I'm the third ghostwriter, and I was told I'd be fired if I didn't include this, but I'm fairly sure none of this is true. And it's just such a great way to tell the story and get to the truth of, it's so much fun. So much fun.
Well, and it gets to this, like what I am fascinated about in pro wrestling are these wrestlers who fall into the characters so much that they believe they are the characters, so that their original identities go away and they just think like Hulk Hogan or Ric Flair, think they are Hulk Hogan or Ric Flair, that the person behind them no longer exists. And I think that's such a bizarre thing. But then you think about your own life. I often think like I do this all the time, right? Like I'm up here, I'm putting on a character, right? Like I'm now writer Sal sitting up here. But in an hour or two, I'll be friend Sal when we're talking, or when I'm with my wife, I'll be different. But we all kind of do this. And I worry about like, oh, have I become the character? What is my actual real self? So I think like that's what I hope is like the universal nugget that you kind of insert in this ridiculous spandex kind of world, that pulls a reader in who doesn't care about wrestling.
Yeah, it's such a fun way in too. I mean, I think because the wrestling personalities are so huge and so obviously ridiculous. You've been a wrestling fan for a long time. I mean, has that brought other things to your writing? You think wrestling has influenced your storytelling?
Wow. I do think so in a way, because it's wrestling culture as, I mean, it's politics now. You see it in regular sports. You see it in hip hop. Like it's kind of tentacled out over the years. But I would say for me, I loved wrestling as a kid. And then like, I think a lot of people, especially in, if you grew up in a kind of working class place and then go to a kind of college, I was beaten out of me really quickly of like, oh, I've got to hide all of this stuff that I thought was normal. So I spent many years just like, I'm not going to think about pro wrestling, or I'm not going to watch sports, or just I now need to put on glasses and then I have to dress like this, and I can't dress like how I used to dress. And then I think for the last 10 years, I've been trying to reclaim all that stuff, and then bring it into my work. And, I can't go back, right? Like that's what a lot of the fiction is about, but can I reclaim it for me now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was something exciting over the years to watch you grow as a writer. Even in grad school, and particularly perhaps the tail end of your time at grad school, to see you kind of picking back up. We had another friend who was super into wrestling. To see you pick back up and then to be like, oh yeah, this is super fun and I can write about this. I mean, your writing really blew up then. I feel like in a great way. You went in hugely different directions. So yeah, I think it's really cool to see that development, the way you're bringing this real passion back in. I'm going to say my favorite setting in the book, I did want to tell you, is I love in The Last Train to Siena, the little trattoria where the old winos, it's just like I love that you describe it as a place for old pro drunks, these aging drinkers who are spending all their times. It's essentially it's an Italian old man wino dive, right? And they're all just spending the entire time angling for drinks off each other. And there are other dives throughout the book, kind of divey bars. What makes that so fun to write about? I mean, I think it is, but
so I mean, Scranton, it's dive bars on every corner, and everyone in there is 1,000 years old, and they like look fused to the bar stool, and I love it. Like that's like one of my favorite places to be in the world, is a place like that. So when I was a kid, I would be in those spaces all the time. Family members would always take me into the dankest bars filled with the oldest people, and I loved it. You get a bag of chips and you get to play the little pinball machine, and it was just great. So for me, it was always a place of comfort and nostalgia. So, but obviously you get a little older, you think about it like, oh gee, that's sure drinking early in the morning, huh? We're sure drinking around kids and driving them around, So I wanted to kind of think about that.
I think you captured the two sides of that too, because it's this very romantic setting, but at the same time, the character is like, I have to take a sip every minute to have my morning wine drunk at exactly the right time. And that's a scary way to live. But enough about old stuff. Let's talk about the future, because you have a couple of stories in here that we delve into the future and some I hesitate to call it speculative fiction, but why not? Some speculative stuff. One of my favorites is you have kind of your own Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind thing going in one of the stories. Characters getting a treatment to forget what she thinks of as her traumatic childhood. I don't know. Why do you think? I love your version of it, but why do you think we're in general just fascinated by this idea of a machine that can erase our brains or parts of our brain?
Okay, so this is a great question. So, you know, the collection has about like 8 years worth of stories. For
Yeah.
me, you know, I could really tell the difference of like, what are the stories from pre-therapy and post-therapy? It's like really obvious, you know? So like this story is like, the fantasy is like, if I could just burn out all the trauma, wouldn't that just be great? You know, like, isn't that the solution? And if I can just, you know, I think it also speaks to like what I was talking about earlier. It's about a working class person who, you know, marries a kind of upper class person. They want that origin destroyed, you know, and they want to have it replaced with kind of memories of more kind of affluent upbringing.
Right.
That's probably the type of thing that I thought would be helpful, you know, at a certain age. But now you know, and the story ends really negatively because I think if you try to do any of that, you realize really quick, like this is going to blow up in my face. So I think that's really what the fiction is about, is coming to terms with it's part of you. So if it's part of you, like, what do you do then? Right. So it's like you have to process it. You can't just escape all the time.
What do you do with this? And I think a lot of these stories are about that question. This is here. What do you do with this? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, fathers and sons and Catholicism, there's a lot of things that you're asking that question of in this book too, I think. And to, you know, children, lives unlived. Yeah. That said, you're writing these stories. I think there's a lot of swagger in these stories, just prose style wise and everything. You swing for the fences in a really wonderful way in a lot of them. And you were saying earlier, like, oh, I don't think it's a very funny book, but I think it's a really funny book. So perhaps I just have a darker sense of humor.
No, I think it's a funny book too. I just meant like it's a book that when I read in front of crowds, it's hard to make jokes. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Like
Totally.
it's not like laugh line.
Do you find it hard to write funny?
No, I feel like my problem is I instinctively go to funny and I need to pull it back sometimes.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, what I really want to do sometimes is like make you laugh to pull the defenses down, and then once the defense is down, I want to rip out your heart. Like that's what I think my goal is as a writer.
Absolutely, yeah. Something we talked about. You and I have been talking about that exact move for 15 years or something.
I'm still trying.
However long it's been, yeah. But yeah, absolutely. It's the classic fiction sucker punch. I think you do it really well. But one thing I think you've played with too, I think the funniest moments in this book are some of the really brash ones where characters are so obviously lying to themselves. And how did you lean into just like having the characters so often are just telling themselves complete untruths about their own lives?
I think it's something I saw growing up a lot. You know, it's like delusion, you know, and self-delusion and all sorts of places. And it's something that's always spoken to me in fiction. So when we were in graduate school, actually in college too, my favorite novel was Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates.
Yeah.
Which is a great novel, and I probably wouldn't say it's my favorite novel now, but it's an important novel for me and my development as a writer. But the whole book is about self-delusion and thinking like I'm going to do this thing when everyone, even the character, knows they're not going to do it. You know, and for some reason that has always just been wedged in my brain.
Absolutely. I think of the first Rabbit book that way a lot too. Which is, God, that's a bold move. The first one, 50, 70 pages are just a car ride in the book, and it's literally the main character just like, I'm going to go see this woman. I'm going to leave my wife behind. My life's going to be so great, and just lying to himself about it. But yeah, it creates so much time. I'm coming to sort of the end of my questions here, but one thing, speaking of endings, I love the story's endings. Each and every one. I'm so excited for this book's, the endings in this story. And I'm going to ramble on because the endings of short stories are something I think about more than a normal person should. Like I think about how to end and how people end short stories a lot. And I think one reason a lot of folks think they don't like short stories is because so many modern ones just kind of dissolve into nothing rather than having a moment or ending. And it became a move a while ago. We could go into the history of it, but nobody wants that. But that dissolve is no longer rebelling against anything. It's just a thing to do. I think anyway, I'll stop. But I love in this book, each and every one of these has real honest to God endings. Characters are revealed to themselves in huge ways. Their desires, their facades are ripped away in moments that are completely unexpected. They don't expect it. And I love that you're not afraid to build up to something big happening at the end of a story. I guess this isn't really a question, it's just me selling the book. What is your philosophy of short story endings?
Well, my favorite ending of a short story is this is cliched, but it's Lady with the Pet Dog with the Chekhov story, where it ends where they know there's no path out. There's a couple and they're both married and they want to be together, but they can't be together because it's the 1900s. And they're like, what are we going to do? We're going to figure it out. And then it just ends. But that this whole thing is just broken down completely. It's an explosion. So for me, I always think a short story, this should be the most important thing that happened in the character's life. Otherwise, why are they telling you that story? That's the justification. I always think if this character is only going to exist in this one story, why did they pick this to tell this moment? So it needs to be something impactful. I'm with you. I don't like the anti-epiphany stories where it's like, I like it as a response, but then when it lasts for decades, it's like, okay, we get it. You don't like Raymond Carver. I got it. It's like, okay,
sure.
I got it, but I think I want sincerity in my fiction.
Yeah.
And I think if you want that, and a lot of people don't want that, and I understand, but if you want it, then there needs to be change, or there needs to be a moment of understanding that there was not change.
Yeah. Yeah. That moment of understanding too. That's fascinating. The idea of sincerity surrounded by all the screens, the characters in these stories, all the facades and everything. Yeah, I mean, you're interested in cutting through those screens and finding the sincerity in there too? Because there are moments of the sincere in those screens, I think.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
I think those lives could be just as valid and as real, the digital lives, as what we experience, every day, Sure. So I don't mean to totally be able to, technology's bad, get rid of phones, buttons are technology, right? Pencil's technology.
Yeah, for sure. This is my last one that I'll throw out to anyone out there who's got any questions, but so your moment to think about your question. So it's a really good one. But I know a lot of your stories in an artistic way. You're working out ideas and feelings that are really close to you, fears, hopes, ideas about particularly home, what it means to leave home behind. And I think you have written memoir before, and I will say, Mega Man 3, that book has a lot of memoir in it. I have a copy available at the front desk for anyone who would like to read it and purchase it. But the vast majority of your work is fiction. Why is it fiction for you to work through these ideas as an artist?
Oh, I need a level of remove. I need to be removed. I don't know how memoirists, like people who really commit to it, do it. I don't think I'm brave enough. Like you have to be so vulnerable on the page. So even if I'm going to do a memoir, it's hidden in a criticism of a video game from the 80s. That's the point where I'm like, yes, we can have 30 pages of memoir here. But I think any fiction writer that's any good, it's like, you don't need the memoir because it's all right there. All their concerns are on the page. Their whole brain has been just splattered on the page for you. So it's like, that's, your soul's on it, so I right now I wouldn't see what the point was, because it's like my fiction is everything and that I'm trying to express.
And it's well expressed.
Oh, thank you.
Indeed. Any other questions that aren't coming from me rambling on? Yes.
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's actually long fiction. I think short fiction is much harder for me because I feel like every moment has to be perfect. Every single word has to be perfect. Where in a novel, I sometimes feel like, okay, it's fine if this paragraph isn't perfect and it's functional. It's kind of serving a plot purpose, and I can just get it as good as I can get it. And as long as what's around it is better, that's okay. And we can kind of come back and address that later. I also think once you're in the novel, you're in it for years, so it's just like, okay, there's a comfort level I know what I'm going back to. But with a short story, there's, you got to come up with it constantly, right? You finish one and then you have to come up with the next one. And there's that fear of, okay, when I'm done with this, am I ever going to have another idea, or was that it? So I like to have the long-term project. So typically with this book, I was mostly writing the stories in between working on longer projects. So I would work on a longer project, get to a point where the draft was done. I sent it to someone for feedback. And then I would start working on some short stuff, because if I'm not writing, my anxiety level will be through the roof, so it's also just a kind of protection method too. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. In some ways they're really similar, but in other ways it can be really, really different. I guess the biggest difference is, when you're writing them, you're sending them out to journals, right? So you're getting them exposed to people earlier. So some of the stories that are the earliest pieces in the book, people read in journals maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. So you're getting that immediate feedback, which for me is really helpful. I like to get feedback. But the novel can be really isolating, where you just in it for years and nobody knows what you're doing, or you can tell people like, this is basically what I'm doing, but you give them 2 lines and they don't really see it. And then it's always nerve wracking when you finally give the draft to people, because, it feels like if somebody doesn't like a novel that you've written, that just seems like such a severe rejection, where a short story, it's like, well, okay, I worked on that for a month, versus 3 years of my life, with a novel. I would say the actual publications, the hardest part, I think, for me was that some of the stories were so early, so some of them were 8 years ago. So I wanted to go in and just tear them apart. And the publisher had to pull me back. So I edited the whole book multiple times. And then right before the book went to press, they're like, okay, well, if you want to, look for any grammatical errors, now's the time. And I'm like, great. And then I made 300 changes. And the publishers basically said, look, the book won the prize. These stories have all been published before. We've been through this process. You've made your changes. At some point, it has to be done. So I guess it's done, but it was very hard to let go of.
I will say there was a famous writer. It wasn't Charles Baxter, but someone in that world who I did see. A friend was at a reading and said, how do you know when you're done with a story? And the guy called him over, and he was reading from a 20-year-old book and showed it to him. And he's like, I made these changes today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I do the same thing. Even reading, tonight, I took out words, and I always hope, I'm like, oh, people are going to follow along, but it'd be better if they didn't, because they won't see what I'm cutting. And I always do that. I'll like mark things out and just, and it's totally normal to follow along. That's what most people do. But I'm always like, oh no, they'll catch on to my secret that I'm editing.
My roots.
I can't let it go.
We do have time for signing, and so you'll have plenty of time to take everyone's book and scratch out the words.
I didn't need that comma.
But any other questions? Katie?
Oh, wow. I've had kind of the opposite, where I get halfway, well, sort of what you're saying, where I get halfway through and think, I'm not sure about this. And then I get very stubborn and think, no, I'm going all the way. And then I finish it and I realize this is very bad. So I think any writer will tell you they've got the 2 or 3 novels sitting in the drawer that, thank God, were not published, So I definitely have that. So you probably read some, so now that I think about it. So definitely that has happened. And I think everyone will tell you that's the process, but it's so hard, so short stories you throw out all the time. I've just tons of short stories that I don't finish or I just give up on. And, again, it's like a month of your life, but the novel's tough. But it gets easier as you go, because it just feels like, okay, well, I had to write that to get to the book that was published, and that's a part of the process that is very hard. So, oh, that's a great question. I've been in the Midwest now. I've lived here. Well, I lived in Indiana before I moved to the Twin Cities. So I guess all told, I've been in the Midwest for 11 years. I love the Midwest, So before that, I lived in Pittsburgh, and I really like a small city. I like that kind of environment, and I there's a friendliness, that's cliched, but I do think that there is a friendliness here and a sincerity. So we were just hanging out with some friends from back east, and I forgot how ironic everyone is. And I used to be so ironic, and now I'm like, oh yeah, how do I do this? So I think the big thing is like I've become more sincere, and I'm glad about that change. So I'm very happy to have moved out here, and I wouldn't move back. Like I love it out here. So I'm very pleased to have moved to the Midwest. And I just think there's just great scenes out here that, like Scranton's close to New York. So you have exposure to that, and you can get up there, and like everyone knows about New York, and everyone knows about the scene. And people in New York only think about LA as the only other place in America. But there's so many just amazing art scenes happening. And I've just loved getting to be a part of those for the last decade. That was so sincere. Like I didn't have any irony at all. Like what happened?
Not the Sal I first met. Yeah, some corners knocked off. That's all right.
A lot of therapy. Medication.
You're doing great. We're all super proud. Yeah, one more.
I think it nourishes it because I think, when you're a writer and you're really in it for, a decade plus, more than that, you're definitely discouraged. More often than not, you're hearing no's. Like this is the rarity. It's like to come out and have a book come out and people read the book and you get reviews like that. I know now that that's rare. I think when I was in my mid-20s and my first book was published very young, and I just thought like, great, this is what it's going to be like every year. Like, this is just going to be awesome. And then the reality sinks in like, oh no, it's going to be like 10 years in the cold, generally, most times. So when I'm really discouraged, I go into the classroom and you just see these 19-year-olds who are so fired up about writing. And they just remind me of me, of just the way that I felt as a teenager. So it brings me right back. So it really is, not every class is like that, but the classes that are, it's a joy to just see them and to just, okay, it rekindles that spirit. That's a great question. Okay, I'm going to ask specific. So is this for you? Are you? And what are your goals? Like, because I would tailor it, so it's like, it's such a big question. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, that's an incredible question. The first thing I'd say is to try and join a writing group. So I would say that every writer I know shares their work, no matter how well published they are. So I would say like try and find a peer group where and I think the key is like you don't want to be the best writer in the group, but you don't want to be the worst writer. You want to be in the middle, like that's always the best, and that's where you get the kind of the best feedback from. So I would say try and find a writing group first. And then one of the hardest things is just carving out the time. So what I always say is like if you can carve out even 15 minutes a day, that's enough. And if you're struggling with ideas and that type of thing, I always say like just use prompts at the start. So I don't think there's anything wrong with just getting a prompt book. So a couple of good ones that I think are great are the 3 a.m. Epiphany and the 4 a.m. Epiphany are really strong. And it's just filled with really concrete, write a scene about this, write a scene about this. And then poetsandwriters.org, they also have a prompt page where you can just go through, fiction prompts or poetry prompts and nonfiction prompts. And then I'd say in your local community, going to events like this, like that's the big thing too, and just figuring out like what the scene is. before worrying about publishing and then all that stuff. But then you want to send your work out to journals. That's what I would say would be the thing after the groups, would be to see what writers, like the writers you like and love, like where did they publish in their early careers, and then start sending your work there. Does that help at all? Is that kind of, okay, good. Yeah, for sure.
All right. I think that's the time we have. But I think the question everyone always wants to know. So speaking of running out of ideas, what's the next idea you haven't run out of? What are you working on?
Oh, well, I'm working on a novel.
Great.
I don't want to say this on tape. I mean, now I'm really committing to.
It can be a big secret. That's okay.
I'm working on a novel.
All right.
And you're going to be shocked. It's about Italian Americans.
Big
and-
secret Italian American
Yeah,
novel.
and it might be about a film production. So
All
that's what I'll
right.
say.
All right. Already sold. Sal, thanks so much. It's been a dream to have you here. So glad we could do this. So thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. So I hope to see you at another event. A couple of quick, easy things. I'm going to take Sal up that way so he can sit down at a table, have a moment to decompress and breathe. And then you can bring books up to him, and I hope he'll be happy to sign them. And like I say, scratch out unnecessary commas in the text of them. And if you haven't yet bought your copy of this spectacular story collection, I hope you will. We have copies for sale at our front desk. That's the flattish surface at the front. One of my colleagues is behind it. Be happy to sell you a copy. Thanks again for being here, folks. Good night.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thanks a lot, man.